The trumpet fell out of Maya Ellison's hands and hit the floor with a hard, ugly sound, and for one terrible second she thought she had cracked the bell. 20 pairs of eyes turned toward her at once. The small stage lights felt like they had doubled in heat. Somewhere near the back of the room, a chair scraped against the floor, and a deep, calm voice said, "Pick it up. You're not done yet." Maya's hands were shaking as she bent down and lifted her father's old trumpet off the worn wooden boards. It was the same trumpet he had bought secondhand at his own pawn shop years ago, the one he never sold because he said some things were not meant to be turned into money. Tonight, of all nights, it had slipped from her sweaty fingers in front of a packed room, in front of a man she never expected to see walk through that door. Wes Calloway sat near the back corner of the club, half hidden by shadow, wearing a plain gray jacket and an old cap pulled low over his eyes. Most people in the room had no idea who he was, but Maya knew. She had grown up listening to his records on her father's dusty turntable, learning to breathe and phrase and bend notes the way he did, long before she ever dreamed she might play in the same room as him. She lifted the trumpet to her lips again, took a breath that trembled just slightly, and finished her solo. The notes came out uneven at first, but by the final phrase, something steadied in her chest, and the sound turned warm and full, filling every corner of the small club. When she lowered the horn, the room erupted into applause, but Maya barely heard it. Her eyes were locked on the man in the back, who was now standing, still watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. The club was called Bennett's, a narrow brick building tucked between a laundromat and a bakery on a quiet street in New Orleans. It was not famous. It did not have velvet ropes or a long line outside. It was the kind of place where local musicians came to test new songs, where the owner, a warm but no-nonsense woman named Nora Bennett, poured drinks herself most nights and never charged a cover on Tuesdays, because she believed music should be for everyone, not just people who could afford it. Maya had been playing there every Tuesday night for almost a year. She worked mornings and afternoons as a waitress at a diner 2 blocks away, saving whatever she could, dreaming of the day she might play trumpet for a living instead of carrying plates of eggs and coffee. Her father, Daniel Hughes, ran the pawn shop where she had grown up sweeping floors and polishing old guitars that came through the door. He always told her the same thing before every show. "You don't get chances twice, Maya. When one comes, you take it with both hands." She had no idea that tonight would be the night those words finally meant something. After her set ended, Maya stepped off the small stage and made her way toward the bar, her heart still pounding from nerves and adrenaline. Her best friend, Lily Turner, who worked as a waitress alongside her at the diner and often came to support her on Tuesday nights, grabbed her arm the moment she got close. "Maya," Lily whispered, her eyes wide with excitement, "do you know who that is sitting in the back?" "I think I do," Maya said quietly, glancing over Lily's shoulder toward the corner table. "But I don't want to say it out loud in case I'm wrong." "You're not wrong," Lily said. "That's Wes Calloway, the actual Wes Calloway. I saw his picture on an old record cover my uncle has. He looks older now, but it's him." Maya felt her stomach twist into a knot. Wes Calloway was not just any musician. He had spent decades touring the world, playing with some of the greatest names in American music, appearing on late-night shows, headlining major festivals, and shaping the sound of an entire generation of trumpet players. He rarely showed up anywhere unannounced, and when he did, it usually meant something important was happening, though nobody in the room that night could have guessed what. The bartender, a friendly older man named Ray Coleman who had worked at Bennett's for over a decade, leaned across the counter toward Maya. "He's been sitting there for the last 3 sets, Ray said in a low voice. "Didn't say a word to anybody, just watched. Until you got up there." Maya swallowed hard. She wanted to disappear into the floor, but at the same time, something inside her lit up with a nervous kind of hope. She had spent years imagining a moment like this, though in her imagination it never felt this terrifying. Before she could decide what to do next, the corner table's chair scraped again, and Wes Calloway stood up fully, revealing a tall, lean figure with silver hair peeking out from under his cap. He walked slowly through the crowd, and the entire room seemed to quiet down as people realized who he was. Whispers spread from table to table like a wave moving across water. He stopped a few feet from Maya and studied her for a long moment before speaking. "That last phrase you played," he said, his voice deep and rough with age, but still full of quiet authority. "Where did that come from?" Maya's mouth went dry. "I don't know," she admitted. "It just came out. I was trying to save the solo after I dropped the horn." Wes nodded slowly, as if that answer satisfied something inside him. "Most players spend their whole careers trying to sound like they don't know what's coming next," he said. "You actually didn't know. That's rare." "Thank you," Maya said, still not quite believing this conversation was happening. "What's your name?" "Maya Ellison." Maya Ellison, he repeated, as if testing the sound of it. How long have you been playing? Since I was 7, she said. My father owns a pawn shop. He kept an old trumpet nobody bought, and I picked it up one day and never really put it down. A small smile crossed Wes's face, the first hint of warmth in his otherwise serious expression. That's usually how the good ones start, he said. Not in fancy schools. In back rooms, with broken instruments nobody wanted. Nora Bennett, who had been watching the exchange from behind the bar with growing curiosity, stepped closer, wiping her hands on a towel. Mr. Calloway, she said carefully, is everything all right? Can I get you something? Wes waved a hand gently, not taking his eyes off Maya. Everything's fine, Nora. I'm just having a conversation with a very interesting young trumpet player. The room had gone almost completely silent now, every customer straining to hear what was happening near the bar. Lily nudged Maya's arm from behind, her face a mixture of excitement and disbelief, but Maya barely noticed. Her entire focus was locked on the legendary musician standing in front of her. I have a proposal for you, Wes said after a pause, and I want you to think carefully before you answer, because I don't offer this to just anyone. Maya felt her pulse quicken. What kind of proposal? A challenge, Wes said simply. Right here, right now, on that stage. You and me. Trading phrases back and forth. No sheet music, no rehearsal, just 2 trumpets, and whatever comes out. A duel, if you want to call it that. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Several people near the bar had already pulled out their phones, sensing that something unforgettable was about to happen. Ray the bartender stopped wiping glasses entirely, and just stared. Nora's mouth had fallen slightly open. Maya's first instinct was pure fear. She had played this small club for a year, but she had never once imagined standing on that stage trading notes with a musician whose records had shaped her entire understanding of the trumpet. What if she froze? What if her hands shook again, and this time the horn didn't just fall but the entire moment fell apart with it? I'm not sure I'm ready for something like that, she said quietly, almost apologetically. Wes studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Nobody's ever ready, he said. That's not how it works. You don't wait until you're ready. You find out you were ready the moment you say yes. Lily leaned in close to Maya's ear. Your dad always says you don't get chances twice, she whispered. This is exactly what he means, Maya. This is the chance. Maya closed her eyes for a brief second, picturing her father standing behind the counter of his pawn shop, the way he always looked up when she walked in after a good show, waiting to hear every detail. She thought about all the mornings she woke up before sunrise to practice scales before her diner shift, all the nights she stayed up late listening to Wes Calloway's old recordings, trying to understand how he made silence feel just as powerful as sound. She opened her eyes and looked directly at Wes Calloway. Okay, she said, her voice steadier than she expected. I'll do it. A ripple of excitement swept through the room. Nora clapped her hands together and immediately began directing people to make space near the stage, her professional instincts kicking in as she recognized this was about to become something the club would be remembered for. Ray grabbed a second microphone stand from the back room. Lily squeezed Maya's shoulder before stepping back into the crowd, her phone already recording. Wes walked toward the small stage with the calm, unhurried steps of a man who had performed in front of thousands of people more times than he could count. Maya followed a few steps behind, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat, gripping her father's old trumpet like it was the only steady thing in the entire room. As they both stepped up onto the worn wooden stage, facing each other under the warm stage lights, Wes turned to the crowd and raised his own trumpet, a polished brass instrument that had clearly traveled the world and back many times over. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, his voice carrying easily across the now packed room. Tonight, you get to witness something I don't do very often. He turned to Maya, lowering his voice just for her. Whatever happens up here, he said, don't hold back. I want to hear everything you've got, not what you think I want to hear. Maya nodded, lifting her trumpet to her lips with hands that had finally, somehow, stopped shaking. The room fell into a hush so complete that the soft hum of the ceiling fans became audible. Every phone in the building was raised and pointed toward the stage. Nora stood frozen behind the bar, towel still in hand. Ray had abandoned his post entirely to watch. Lily stood near the front, eyes wide, recording every second. Wes Calloway lifted his trumpet first, closed his eyes for a brief moment, and then, without any warning or countdown, played the opening phrase of the duel that would change Maya Ellison's entire life. The first note hung in the air, bright and clean, and the room seemed to hold its breath as one. Nobody in that club that Tuesday night, not Maya, not Wes, not Nora or Ray or Lily, could have predicted how far the sound from that single trumpet phrase would eventually travel, or how many lives it would touch before the story was finished. But in that exact moment, none of that mattered yet. All that mattered was the next note, and whether Maya Ellison, waitress by day and dreamer by night, would find the courage to answer it. She raised the trumpet to her lips, closed her eyes just as he had, and waited for the sound to come. The first phrase Wes Calloway played was fast and bright, a run of notes that climbed upward like a staircase before twisting suddenly into a low, growling turn that seemed impossible for a man his age to produce with such ease. It was a technical phrase, precise and dazzling, clearly meant as a test. Several people in the crowd gasped audibly. Lily's hand flew to her mouth. Nora leaned forward over the bar, gripping the edge with both hands. Maya listened to every note land, felt the shape of the phrase settle into her memory. And then, instead of trying to copy what she had just heard, she did something different. She played the same melodic idea but slowed it down, stripped away half the notes, and let the remaining ones breathe with more weight and feeling. Where Wes had been dazzling, she was raw. Where he had shown off speed, she showed restraint. The room seemed to lean forward as one. Wes's eyebrows rose slightly, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. He had expected her to try matching his speed, to chase him note for note the way most young players did when challenged by someone with his reputation. Instead, she had taken his idea and turned it into something entirely her own, something more personal. "Interesting," he murmured, just loud enough for those nearest the stage to hear. He answered with a second phrase, this one built around a repeated low note that pulsed like a heartbeat, before breaking suddenly into a sharp, high burst of sound that cut through the room like lightning. The crowd erupted into scattered applause even before Maya had a chance to respond, stunned by the sheer control in his playing. Maya felt her pulse quicken, but this time it was not entirely fear. Somewhere underneath the nervousness, something else was rising, something that felt almost like joy. She had spent years alone in her bedroom, trumpet pressed to her lips, trying to recreate exactly this kind of musical conversation, using nothing but recordings and her own imagination. Now it was actually happening, in real time, in front of a room full of witnesses. She answered his heartbeat rhythm with one of her own, but twisted the timing just slightly off balance, creating a sense of tension that made the crowd shift uncomfortably in their seats, waiting for resolution. Then, right when the tension felt almost unbearable, she resolved it with a soft, warm note that seemed to release all the pressure at once. Several people in the crowd actually laughed with relief, the kind of laughter that comes from being emotionally surprised by music in a way words could never explain. Wes tilted his head slightly, studying her with newfound interest. This was no longer simply a demonstration for an eager young talent. Something in his expression had shifted into genuine curiosity, the look of a man discovering he might actually be challenged. "You're not just copying patterns," he said quietly, almost to himself. "You're listening." The duel continued, phrase after phrase, each one building on the last, each one raising the stakes slightly higher. Wes tried a rapid series of short, punchy notes, almost like a rhythm rather than a melody. Maya answered by slowing everything down into long, sustained tones that seemed to stretch time itself, forcing the entire room into a kind of hushed patience. Then she suddenly broke the pattern with 3 quick, playful notes that made several people in the crowd laugh out loud, delighted by the unexpected humor hidden inside the music. Nora had completely stopped working behind the bar now, standing perfectly still with her arms crossed, eyes fixed on the stage. Ray had climbed up onto a stool near the back wall just to get a better view over the crowd. Lily's phone battery was draining fast from continuous recording, but she refused to stop filming even for a second, sensing somehow that this moment mattered far beyond just tonight. Word had apparently begun spreading outside the club as well. Through the front windows, Maya could see a small crowd gathering on the sidewalk, drawn by the sound spilling out through the open door. People pressing close to the glass, phones raised, trying to catch a glimpse of what was happening inside. The exchanges between Maya and Wes grew increasingly complex. He tried a phrase built around unusual intervals, notes that jumped in strange, unexpected directions, clearly testing whether she could follow the logic of something unfamiliar. Maya hesitated for just a fraction of a second, her mind racing to process the pattern, before answering with her own version, not identical, but clearly built from the same musical idea, proving she had understood the challenge even if she hadn't repeated it exactly. Wes nodded approvingly, a small smile finally breaking through his otherwise serious expression. "Good," he said. "Very good." As the duel progressed, something remarkable began happening within Maya. The fear that had gripped her so tightly at the beginning of the night slowly transformed into something closer to trust, not just trust in Wes, but trust in herself, in her own instincts, in the years of practice that had shaped her without her even fully realizing it. Every note she played now felt less like an attempt to prove herself, and more like an honest expression of who she actually was as a musician. The crowd had grown considerably since the duel began, spilling out from the bar area and pressing closer to the stage, though everyone remained respectfully quiet during each exchange, understanding instinctively that any interruption would break the delicate energy building in the room. Even the usual background noise of clinking glasses and shuffling chairs had faded almost completely. Wes raised his trumpet again, and this time, something in his posture shifted, becoming more serious, more focused. He played a phrase unlike anything he had offered so far, something deeply emotional, built around a descending melody that seemed to carry real weight and sadness, notes that lingered in the air long after they had technically ended. It was clear to everyone in the room that this was no longer just a technical challenge. This was Wes Calloway, revealing something personal through his instrument, testing whether Maya could meet him not just musically but emotionally. The room fell into an even deeper silence, almost reverent, as the final note faded into nothing. Maya stood still for a long moment, trumpet lowered slightly, processing what she had just heard. She thought about her father, about the long nights he worked alone in his pawn shop after her mother passed away when Maya was still young, about the quiet sacrifices he had made without ever complaining, about the way music had become the one language that let them communicate feelings neither of them knew how to say out loud. She lifted the trumpet back to her lips and played. The phrase that came out was simple, almost painfully simple compared to everything that had come before it, just a handful of notes, slow and deliberate, carrying an ache that seemed far too mature for someone her age. It was not flashy, it was not technically impressive, but it was completely, unmistakably honest, and that honesty landed on the room like a wave. Several people in the audience visibly reacted, some pressing hands to their chests, others simply going still, caught completely off guard by the emotional weight carried in such a short, uncomplicated musical statement. Lily lowered her phone slightly, tears unexpectedly welling in her eyes. Even Ray, who had worked behind that bar for over a decade and considered himself impossible to surprise, felt something tighten in his throat. Wes Calloway lowered his own trumpet slowly, staring at Maya with an expression that had completely shed its earlier composure. For the first time all evening, the confident, legendary musician looked genuinely moved, caught off guard by a 22-year-old waitress playing a second-hand trumpet in a small neighborhood club. "Where," he said slowly, his voice noticeably rougher than before, "did you learn to do that?" Maya lowered her own instrument, breathing hard, her chest rising and falling with the effort of everything she had just poured into those few notes. "I didn't learn it," she said honestly. "I just felt it, and it came out." Wes was quiet for a long moment, studying her with an intensity that made the rest of the room seem to disappear entirely, as if the conversation had shrunk down to just the two of them standing together under those warm stage lights. Neither of them noticed that outside, the small crowd gathered by the front windows had grown even larger, or that among the many phones recording the moment, at least a few live streams had already begun quietly circulating across different corners of the internet, carrying the sound of that small club in New Orleans out into a world that had no idea yet what it was about to discover. Inside Bennett's, the duel was not yet finished. There was still one more exchange left to come, one final phrase that neither Maya nor Wes could have predicted, one that would end the evening in a way nobody in that room would ever forget. For a moment, neither Maya nor Wes moved. The last note of her simple, aching phrase still seemed to hang somewhere near the ceiling of the club, refusing to fully disappear. Then Wes straightened his shoulders, lifted his chin slightly, and something in his eyes changed again, shifting from quiet admiration into something sharper, more focused, almost hungry. "You want to know something?" he said, loud enough now for the whole room to hear. "In 40 years of playing this instrument, I've had exactly 3 people surprise me on a stage. You just became the 4th. A ripple of excited murmurs spread through the crowd, but Wes held up a hand, silencing the room instantly with the kind of authority that came from decades of commanding attention. "But I'm not finished yet," he said, turning back to Maya with a small, sharp smile. "Let's see what you do with this." He lifted his trumpet high, took a breath that seemed to fill his entire chest, and launched into a phrase unlike anything he had played so far that night. It began in the upper register, notes so high and precise they seemed to vibrate the very air of the club, before tumbling downward through a rapid series of turns and twists that most professional trumpet players would need weeks of practice to execute cleanly. It was blistering, technical, and clearly designed to push Maya far beyond anything she had faced in her life. Gasps rippled through the audience. Lily's mouth fell open. Nora gripped the bar counter so hard her knuckles turned pale. Even Ray, who had seen countless musicians pass through that club over the years, shook his head slowly in disbelief at what he had just witnessed. Maya felt her stomach drop. She recognized immediately that this was not simply another exchange in their musical conversation. This was a genuine test, the hardest thing Wes had thrown at her all night, and everyone in the room understood it instantly. The energy shifted, becoming electric, almost unbearable in its intensity. Several phones near the front of the crowd zoomed in closer, sensing that whatever happened next would define the entire evening. For a moment, Maya's mind raced through every possible response. She could try to match his speed, attempt to climb into that same high register and chase him through those same dizzying turns, proving she had the technical skill to survive his challenge. Every instinct told her that was what everyone in the room expected, what Wes himself might even be hoping to see. But something deeper inside her, some quiet, steady voice that sounded remarkably like her father, reminded her of the very first lesson he had taught her all those years ago in the back room of his pawn shop. "Anybody can play loud," he used to say, tapping the side of his own head. "Not everybody can make people feel something. That's the real trick, Maya. That's what separates a musician from a noisemaker." She thought about that old second-hand trumpet, the one still warm in her hands right now, the one nobody had wanted to buy, the one that had somehow ended up being exactly what she needed. She thought about every quiet morning she practiced alone before her diner shift, not because anyone was watching, but because she genuinely loved the sound she could make when nobody else was around to judge her. Instead of chasing Wes into that impossible high register, Maya lowered her trumpet slightly, closed her eyes, and did something almost nobody expected. She stopped. For 3 full seconds, complete silence filled the club. No notes, no sound at all beyond the soft hum of the ceiling fans and the shuffling breath of a crowd holding its collective attention. Wes lowered his own trumpet slightly, watching her with narrowed eyes, uncertain what was about to happen. Then, very softly, Maya began to play again, but not the wild technical response everyone expected. Instead, she played something achingly simple, a slow, deliberate melody built from just a handful of notes, each one placed with careful intention, each one allowed to breathe fully before the next arrived. It was the musical equivalent of a whisper after a shout, and the effect on the room was immediate and overwhelming. Several people in the audience actually leaned forward without realizing it, drawn physically closer by the quiet intensity of what they were hearing. Lily lowered her phone entirely, forgetting to keep recording for several precious seconds, too caught up in the moment to remember anything, except how it felt to listen. Nora pressed a hand against her chest, visibly moved. Even the small crowd still gathered outside the front windows had gone completely still, straining to hear every fragile note drifting out into the street. Maya's melody built slowly, note by note, into something that felt less like a musical challenge and more like a confession. It carried echoes of everything that had happened in her life up to this exact moment: the loss of her mother when she was young, the quiet strength of her father working alone in that pawn shop, the years of practicing in secret, dreaming of a chance that felt impossibly far away until, suddenly, tonight, it wasn't far away at all. It was standing right in front of her. The final note of her phrase was the longest of the entire night, a single sustained tone that seemed to stretch time itself, holding the room completely captive until it finally, gently faded into silence. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. For several long seconds, the entire club remained frozen, caught in the aftermath of something nobody quite had words for. Then Wes Calloway slowly lowered his trumpet completely, letting it hang loosely at his side, and stared at Maya with an expression that had shed every trace of performance or showmanship. What remained was simply a man, deeply moved, standing in stunned silence in front of a young woman who had somehow managed to surprise him in a way he clearly had not expected possible anymore, not after 4 decades of playing this instrument in front of audiences all over the world. "I don't," he started, then stopped, shaking his head slightly, searching for words that seemed to be escaping him entirely. He tried again. "I haven't heard anyone play something that honest in a very long time," he finally said, his voice noticeably unsteady. "Not from someone twice your age, not from someone with twice your experience." The room remained silent, waiting, sensing that whatever came next would matter enormously. Then, slowly, Wes began to clap. It started as a single sound in the quiet room, deliberate and clear, and then, almost instantly, the entire club erupted around it, the applause growing louder and louder until it filled every corner of the building, spilling out through the open front door onto the street outside, where the crowd gathered on the sidewalk joined in as well, even though most of them had only caught fragments of what had actually happened inside. Maya stood on that small stage, trumpet still in her hands, overwhelmed by the sound washing over her, unable to fully process that the man she had grown up admiring through old records was standing right beside her, applauding her the same way she had once imagined applauding him from some faraway audience seat she never expected to actually occupy. Lily rushed toward the stage, tears streaming freely down her face now, and wrapped Maya in a tight hug the moment she stepped down. "You did it," Lily kept repeating, her voice thick with emotion. "Maya, you actually did it." Nora came around from behind the bar, something Maya had genuinely never seen her do before during business hours, and pulled Maya into a brief, warm embrace as well. "I've owned this club for 15 years, Nora said, wiping at her own eyes with the back of her hand. "I have never, not once, seen anything like what just happened on that stage." Ray, still standing on his stool near the back wall, simply shook his head in wonder, a wide smile spreading across his weathered face. Amid all the noise and celebration, Wes Calloway waited patiently near the edge of the stage until the initial excitement had settled slightly, watching Maya with quiet, careful attention. When their eyes finally met again across the crowded room, he offered her a small nod, one that seemed to carry far more weight than any words could have managed. He made his way slowly through the crowd toward her, people parting respectfully to let him pass, many still too stunned by what they had just witnessed to fully approach him themselves. When he finally reached Maya, he extended his hand. "Maya Ellison," he said, his voice returning to its usual calm authority, though something softer still lingered underneath it. "I came into this club tonight because a friend told me there was talent worth hearing in New Orleans. I did not expect to find someone who would remind me why I fell in love with this instrument in the first place, all those years ago." Maya shook his hand, her own still trembling slightly from the adrenaline of everything that had just happened. "I honestly don't know what came over me," she admitted. "I've never played like that before, not in front of anyone." "That's exactly why it worked," Wes said. "The moment you stop performing and start telling the truth through your instrument, that's when real music happens. Most players spend their entire careers trying to find that moment. You found it tonight, in your first real challenge." Around them, the club continued buzzing with excited conversation, people replaying video clips on their phones, already sharing what they had witnessed with friends and family who hadn't been lucky enough to be there in person. Nobody in that room yet understood how quickly and how far those small, shaky phone recordings would travel once the night was over. Wes glanced around at the celebrating crowd for a moment before turning back to Maya, his expression growing slightly more serious. "I have to leave for a tour commitment early tomorrow morning," he said. "But before I go, I want you to know something important. What just happened here tonight was not luck, and it was not an accident. That kind of playing comes from somewhere deep, somewhere real. Don't let anyone, including yourself, ever convince you otherwise." Maya nodded, still trying to fully absorb everything happening around her. "Thank you," she managed to say. "This whole night still doesn't feel completely real." Wes offered her one final, genuine smile before glancing toward the door, where a car was apparently already waiting for him outside. "Get some rest tonight if you can," he said. "Something tells me tomorrow is going to look very different from today." He turned and made his way through the crowd toward the exit, pausing briefly to shake hands with Nora and thank her for the evening, before disappearing out into the New Orleans night, leaving behind a club full of people who would spend the rest of the evening, and likely the rest of their lives, talking about what they had just witnessed. Maya stood near the stage for a long moment after he left, her father's old trumpet still warm in her hands, trying to steady the wild mixture of emotions rushing through her all at once. Excitement, disbelief, exhaustion, and something else entirely, something that felt dangerously close to hope, a feeling she had learned over the years to keep carefully guarded, just in case. She had no idea, standing there in that small, familiar club, that Wes Calloway's parting words about tomorrow looking different would turn out to be a significant understatement, or that by the time the sun rose over New Orleans the following morning, her entire life would already be quietly, irreversibly changing, one shared video at a time. Maya woke up the next morning to the sound of her phone buzzing so constantly against her nightstand that at first she thought something was wrong with the device itself. She reached over, still half asleep, squinting at the screen, and froze completely when she saw the number of notifications waiting for her. Hundreds of messages. Then, as she scrolled further in disbelief, thousands. She sat up quickly, suddenly wide awake, her heart pounding as she opened the first video link someone had sent her. It was footage from inside Bennett's the night before, shaky and slightly out of focus in places, clearly filmed on someone's phone from somewhere near the front of the crowd. But the sound was unmistakably clear, capturing every single note of her duel with Wes Calloway from beginning to end. The caption above the video read simply, Legendary musician meets his match in random New Orleans club, and it will give you chills. Maya's hands trembled slightly as she scrolled through comment after comment, message after message, from people all over the country, and increasingly, all over the world. Strangers describing how the video had brought them to tears. Musicians sharing technical breakdowns of specific phrases she had played, analyzing choices she had made purely on instinct in the heat of the moment. Young trumpet players saying she had inspired them to pick their instruments back up after years of not playing. Her phone rang before she could fully process any of it. It was Lily. "Please tell me you're seeing this," Lily said the second Maya answered, her voice high with excitement. "Maya, it's everywhere. I mean everywhere. I've counted at least 6 different versions of that video, and they're all getting hundreds of thousands of views. I'm looking at it right now," Maya said, still barely believing what she was reading. "Lily, I don't understand how this happened this fast." "It happened because what you did last night was incredible," Lily said simply. "The whole internet agrees with me, apparently." Maya climbed out of bed and made her way toward her small kitchen, still scrolling through her phone in disbelief, when a new notification appeared at the top of her screen. An unknown number was calling. She hesitated for a moment before answering. "Hello?" "Maya Ellison," said a familiar deep voice on the other end, warm and slightly amused. "I hope I didn't wake you." Maya nearly dropped her phone. "Mr. Calloway," she said, steadying herself against her kitchen counter. "No, I'm awake. I've actually been awake for the last 20 minutes trying to figure out what happened to my phone." Wes chuckled softly. "I imagine it's been a busy morning. My manager sent me one of the videos about an hour ago, before I'd even had my coffee. Apparently half the internet witnessed what happened at that club last night." "I still can't quite believe it," Maya admitted. "This whole thing still doesn't feel completely real." "It's very real," Wes said, his tone growing slightly more serious. "And I want to be honest with you about why I'm calling. Because I don't think this conversation should wait." Maya sat down at her small kitchen table, gripping the phone tightly. "Okay," she said. "I'm listening." "That last phrase you played last night," Wes said slowly. "The simple one. Right before I stopped the duel completely. I've been thinking about it all morning, and I couldn't quite place why it affected me so deeply until about an hour ago." He paused. "It reminded me of my old mentor, a man named Elias Grant, who taught me everything I know about this instrument when I was younger than you are now. He used to play something very similar, that same kind of quiet, honest phrasing, whenever he wanted to say something words couldn't properly express." Maya felt a lump rise in her throat, though she wasn't entirely sure why. "I had no idea," she said quietly. "I wasn't trying to copy anyone. It just came out." "That's exactly the point," Wes said. "It came out honestly, the same way it used to come out of him. I haven't spoken to Elias in almost 20 years. We had a falling out, over something foolish, the kind of thing that seems important in the moment, and completely meaningless with enough distance. Hearing you play last night reminded me of everything I lost when I let that friendship slip away." The kitchen was quiet for a moment, except for the soft hum of Maya's old refrigerator. "I'm sorry," she said gently. "That sounds painful." "It is," Wes admitted. "But that's not why I'm calling you this morning. I'm calling because I want to offer you something, and I want you to understand it's not charity, and it's not simply because a video of you is spreading across the internet. I want to personally mentor you, Maya. I want to teach you what Elias taught me, and honestly, I think in the process, you might end up teaching me something as well." Maya sat frozen, phone pressed tightly against her ear, hardly able to process what she was hearing. "Mr. Calloway, I don't know what to say." "Say yes," Wes replied simply. "And call me Wes. Mr. Calloway makes me sound far older than I already feel most mornings." A small laugh escaped Maya despite the overwhelming emotion of the moment. "Yes," she said. "Of course, yes. Thank you so much." "Good," Wes said, satisfaction clear in his voice. "My manager, a man named Ben Carter, will reach out to you later today to sort out the practical details. I have tour commitments over the next several weeks, but I want you traveling with part of the band starting soon, learning in real time rather than sitting in some studio going through exercises out of a book." Maya could hardly breathe. "I have a job," she said suddenly, remembering her diner shifts, the reality of her ordinary daily life crashing briefly back into focus. "I can't just leave without notice." "Take care of your responsibilities properly," Wes said. "I respect people who honor their commitments. But don't take too long deciding, Maya. Life doesn't offer many moments like the one you created last night, and I don't intend to let this one slip away either." After they hung up, Maya sat at her kitchen table for a long time, staring at her phone, trying to fully absorb everything that had just happened in the span of a single conversation. Just 24 hours earlier, she had been dreading another slow Tuesday shift at the diner, wondering, as she often did during quiet moments, whether her dream of playing trumpet for a living was realistic or simply a comforting fantasy she clung to in order to survive the monotony of daily life. She immediately called her father. Daniel Hughes answered on the second ring, his familiar, steady voice immediately calming some of the wild energy still buzzing through Maya's chest. "Maya," he said warmly, "I was just about to call you. Have you seen what people are saying online about last night?" "Dad," Maya said, her voice cracking slightly with emotion she could no longer hold back. "Wes Calloway just called me. He wants to mentor me. He wants me to travel with his band." "Where's?" There was a brief pause on the other end of the line, before her father spoke again, his voice noticeably thick. "Maya," he said slowly, "do you remember what I always told you, every single time before you walked into that club? You don't get chances twice," she said quietly, tears now falling freely down her own cheeks. "Take it with both hands." "That's right," Daniel said, "and I think for the first time in a long time, I finally get to watch you do exactly that." Over the following days, Maya's life transformed at a dizzying pace. News outlets picked up the story, running headlines about the unexpected discovery at a small New Orleans jazz club. Local reporters requested interviews. A young journalist named Sophie Grant, writing for a regional arts publication, spent an entire afternoon at Bennett's interviewing Maya, Nora, and even Ray, piecing together the full story behind the viral video that had captured the internet's attention so completely. Nora's small club, which had operated quietly for 15 years without much outside recognition, suddenly found itself flooded with customers eager to see the exact stage where the legendary duel had taken place. Long lines formed outside on Tuesday nights, the very night that had once been Maya's quiet, unremarkable weekly show. Nora, ever practical despite the sudden attention, used the opportunity to fund long overdue renovations to the building, while still keeping the atmosphere as warm and welcoming as it had always been. Maya gave her notice at the diner with genuine gratitude rather than relief, thanking her manager and co-workers sincerely for the years of steady work that had allowed her to pursue music on the side, without ever having to fully abandon her dream out of financial necessity. Lily, still working there herself, promised to visit her at every single show she could possibly make it to, no matter how far Maya's new opportunities eventually took her. Wes's manager, Ben Carter, called exactly as promised, walking Maya through the arrangements for joining the touring band as both a mentee and, gradually, an active performer in Wes's live shows. The details felt overwhelming at times, filled with unfamiliar terms and schedules, but Ben proved patient and thorough, clearly experienced in helping new artists navigate exactly this kind of sudden, dramatic life change. Before Maya left New Orleans for her first tour stop, she visited her father's pawn shop one final time. She found him behind the counter as always, carefully polishing an old guitar that had just come in from a customer, the same familiar scene she had witnessed countless times throughout her childhood. "I brought something for you," she said, reaching into her bag and pulling out a small, framed photograph. It was a still image captured from one of the viral videos, showing the exact moment she and Wes had shaken hands after the duel, both of them smiling, the entire club visible behind them, caught in a moment of shared celebration. Daniel took the photograph carefully, studying it for a long moment in silence, his eyes glistening. "Your mother would have been so proud of you," he finally said softly, setting the frame down gently on the counter beside the cash register, right next to a small photo of Maya as a young girl, standing proudly with her very first second-hand trumpet. "I wouldn't be here without you," Maya said, her voice thick with emotion. "Every single lesson you ever taught me came from you, Dad, not from any school or teacher. From you, standing right here in this shop." Daniel pulled his daughter into a tight embrace, holding on for a long moment before finally stepping back, wiping quickly at his own eyes with the back of his hand. "Go," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion clearly still present underneath it. "Go take that chance, Maya. Both hands, remember?" Maya smiled through her own tears, nodding firmly. "Both hands," she repeated. As she stepped out of the familiar pawn shop and into the bright New Orleans afternoon, her father's old trumpet case in hand, Maya had no way of knowing just how far this unexpected journey would eventually take her, or how many more lives, including her own, would be changed forever because of one shaky, uncertain note played on an ordinary Tuesday night that had turned out to be anything but ordinary at all. 8 months passed in what felt to Maya like both an eternity and the blink of an eye. She traveled through more cities than she had ever imagined visiting in her lifetime, sitting in the back of tour buses late at night while the world blurred past the windows, listening to Wes tell stories about musicians long gone, lessons learned the hard way, and mistakes he hoped she would never have to repeat herself. The mentorship Wes had promised turned out to be far more demanding than Maya had anticipated, though not in the way she initially expected. It was not about technical drills or rigid exercises. Instead, Wes pushed her constantly to dig deeper into her own instincts, to trust the same honest, unguarded playing that had first caught his attention that night at Bennett's, even when nerves or self-doubt urged her to retreat into safer, more predictable patterns. "Anyone can learn technique," he told her once, during a quiet afternoon backstage before a show in Chicago. "Technique just takes time and repetition. What you have is much harder to teach, and much easier to lose if you're not careful. Don't let anyone, including me, talk you out of trusting it." Slowly, gradually, Maya's role within the touring band expanded. What began as simply shadowing Wes during rehearsals evolved into short solos during live performances, moments where the spotlight would shift briefly toward her, while the rest of the band supported quietly behind. Audiences responded warmly at first, curious about the young woman traveling alongside the legendary Wes Calloway, but as the tour progressed, that curiosity transformed into genuine admiration and, eventually, enthusiastic fans of her own. Sophie Grant, the journalist who had first interviewed Maya back at Bennett's, continued following her story over the following months, publishing periodic updates that traced Maya's journey from unknown local player to rising musician in her own right. A radio host named Ellie Frost, who ran a popular late-night music program, invited Maya on air for an extended interview, during which Maya spoke openly about her father, her mother's passing, and the pawn shop where her entire musical journey had quietly begun, years before anyone outside her small New Orleans neighborhood ever knew her name. Not everything about the sudden change was easy. There were nights when exhaustion from constant travel left Maya questioning whether she had truly earned her place alongside musicians who had spent decades perfecting their craft. There were moments of self-doubt backstage, staring at her reflection before a show, wondering if the enormous expectations now surrounding her would eventually prove she was simply a fortunate accident, rather than a genuinely talented musician deserving of this opportunity. During one particularly difficult night in Denver, after a performance where Maya felt she had played too cautiously, holding back the same honesty that had originally defined her, Wes found her sitting alone backstage, trumpet resting quietly in her lap. "You played it safe tonight," he said, settling into the chair beside her without any judgment in his tone, simply stating an observation. "I know," Maya admitted quietly. "I keep thinking about all these people who came specifically to hear me, and I panic. I start worrying about disappointing them instead of just playing." Wes nodded slowly, understanding clearly written across his weathered face. "I felt exactly the same thing after my very first big tour," he said. "For almost a year I played scared, trying desperately to prove I belonged somewhere that terrified me. It nearly ruined the entire reason I fell in love with this instrument in the first place." "How did you fix it?" Maya asked. "I remembered why I started," Wes said simply, "not to impress anyone, not to prove anything to critics or audiences. I started because playing trumpet was the only time in my whole life I ever felt completely, honestly myself. The moment I remembered that, the fear started losing its grip." Maya sat quietly, absorbing his words, thinking again about the diner shifts, the quiet mornings practicing alone before dawn, the second-hand trumpet nobody else had wanted. She thought about Wes's old mentor, Elias Grant, the man he had lost touch with decades earlier, and the way her simple, honest phrase that first night had somehow reopened something painful and important within Wes himself. "Have you thought any more about reaching out to him?" she asked quietly. "Elias, I mean." Wes was silent for a long moment, staring off into the middle distance of the quiet backstage hallway. "I have, actually," he admitted eventually. "More than I expected to, honestly. I think, in a strange way, meeting you reminded me that some chances really don't come twice, no matter how much pride tries convincing you otherwise." A few weeks later, during a stop in Atlanta, Wes surprised everyone in the touring band by inviting an elderly guest to attend that evening's performance from a reserved seat near the front of the stage. When Maya glanced out during a break between songs and saw the older man sitting there, watching Wes with an expression of quiet, complicated emotion, she immediately understood exactly who he was. After the show, Wes brought Elias Grant backstage personally, introducing him to Maya with genuine warmth evident in his voice for the first time in weeks. The two old friends spent nearly an hour talking quietly in a corner of the room, years of unspoken distance slowly beginning to soften, while Maya watched from a respectful distance, feeling a quiet sense of gratitude that her own small, unplanned moment on that stage in New Orleans had somehow helped repair something so much larger than herself. As the tour continued through the following months, Maya's confidence steadily grew. though it never lost the honest, grounded quality that had first defined her playing that night at Bennett's. Reviewers frequently commented on this quality specifically, noting how unusual it was to find a young performer whose playing felt so unguarded, so genuinely emotional, rather than simply technically impressive. Eventually, as the tour schedule wound its way back toward the southern states, Wes made an announcement to the band that surprised almost everyone except Maya, who had been quietly hoping for exactly this possibility for weeks. The final show of this particular leg of the tour would take place not in some enormous arena, but back in New Orleans, at a small, familiar club that had, in many ways, started this entire remarkable journey. Nora Bennett was overjoyed when Ben Carter first reached out to arrange the details, immediately clearing her calendar and beginning preparations for what she quickly realized would be the single biggest night in her club's 15-year history. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood, and within days, every available ticket had been claimed, with a long waiting list forming almost immediately afterward. On the night of the show, Maya arrived at Bennett's hours early, wanting time alone to walk through the space before the crowds arrived. The club looked different now, freshly renovated thanks to the steady stream of curious visitors over the past several months, though Nora had carefully preserved the same warm, welcoming atmosphere that had always made the place feel like home, rather than simply another venue. Maya stood on the small stage, running her fingers gently along the polished wood, remembering the exact spot where her trumpet had slipped from her nervous hands all those months earlier, the accident that had somehow, impossibly, set this entire chain of events into motion. She thought about how frightened she had been that night, how certain she had felt that dropping her instrument in front of a room full of strangers marked the worst possible way to begin what should have been an important performance. Instead, it had marked the beginning of everything. As the evening progressed and the club filled steadily with excited patrons, familiar faces began appearing throughout the crowd. Ray took his usual position behind the bar, though tonight he had brought in extra help to manage the overwhelming demand. Lily arrived early, securing a spot close to the stage, practically vibrating with excitement as she waited for the show to begin. Sophie Grant arrived with a small recording crew, planning to document the full-circle performance for a feature story she had been developing for months. Near the front of the room, in a seat Maya had specifically requested be reserved, sat her father, Daniel Hughes, dressed slightly more formally than his usual work clothes from the pawn shop, though he still wore the same steady, proud expression he always carried whenever watching his daughter perform. When the show finally began, Wes opened with several songs from his extensive catalog, the band playing tightly together after months of touring, clearly comfortable and confident in front of the enthusiastic New Orleans crowd. Then, partway through the set, he stepped toward the microphone and addressed the audience directly. "Almost a year ago," he said, his voice carrying easily across the packed club, "I walked into this exact building on an ordinary Tuesday night, expecting nothing more than a quiet evening of local music. What I found instead changed my entire understanding of what this instrument, and honestly, what this entire career, still had left to teach me." The crowd fell into an attentive hush, many of them already knowing exactly where this story was heading, having watched the viral videos and followed Maya's journey closely over the intervening months. "I want to bring someone up here," Wes continued, "someone who reminded me, in the most unexpected way possible, why I fell in love with playing music in the first place. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Maya Ellison." The applause that greeted Maya as she stepped onto the stage was thunderous, filling every corner of the small club and spilling out through the open doors onto the street beyond, where a crowd had once again gathered, just as they had that very first night, drawn by the promise of witnessing something special. Maya lifted her father's old trumpet, the same second-hand instrument that had traveled with her through every step of this remarkable journey, and looked out across the crowd until her eyes found her father, sitting proudly in the front row, exactly where he belonged. She and Wes played together for nearly 20 minutes, trading phrases back and forth with the same easy, honest communication that had first connected them on this very stage, though now their playing carried the added depth of months spent learning from each other, growing together as musicians and, in a way neither of them had expected that first night, as genuine friends. As their performance built toward its natural conclusion, Wes stepped back slightly, gesturing for Maya to take the final phrase alone. The room grew quiet in anticipation, sensing that whatever came next would carry special significance. Maya closed her eyes, took a slow breath, and played the exact same simple, honest phrase that had first surprised Wes all those months earlier, the one built from just a handful of careful notes, carrying the same aching, genuine emotion that had started this entire journey. But this time, rather than fear and uncertainty, the phrase carried something new underneath it, a quiet confidence earned through months of hard work, travel, and growth. When the final note faded into silence, the club erupted into applause that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building, the entire crowd rising to their feet as one, honoring not just a talented performance, but an entire remarkable story that had unfolded before their eyes over the course of a single unforgettable year. Backstage after the show, once the crowds had finally begun thinning out and the initial excitement had settled into warm, contented conversation, Maya found a quiet moment alone with her father near the small back entrance of the club. "I still remember the day you brought that trumpet home," Daniel said softly, glancing down at the worn instrument still resting in his daughter's hands. "I honestly thought you'd lose interest within a few weeks, the way most kids do with something new. I never imagined it would lead to something like this." "Neither did I," Maya admitted, smiling. "But I think, somewhere deep down, you always believed I could do something with it, even when I didn't fully believe it myself." Daniel reached out and gently squeezed his daughter's shoulder, his eyes glistening with the same quiet pride he had carried throughout her entire journey. "You don't get chances twice," he said softly, repeating the familiar words one final time. "But every once in a while, if you're paying attention, and if you're brave enough to take that chance with both hands, one single moment can end up changing absolutely everything." Maya looked down at the old trumpet in her hands, thinking back over the past year, from the shaking, uncertain waitress who had dropped her instrument on an ordinary Tuesday night, to the confident musician now standing in the same familiar club, surrounded by the people who had supported her from the very beginning of this unlikely, extraordinary journey. Outside, the New Orleans night continued on as it always had, filled with music drifting from open doorways up and down the street, each note carrying its own small story into the darkness. But inside Bennett's, in the club where it had all begun, one particular story had finally come full circle, proving that sometimes, the most ordinary nights hold the potential to become the most extraordinary turning points of an entire life. If only someone is brave enough to lift their instrument, take a breath, and play.